Thank you for tuning in to TorqueKingTV. In this video, we're going to be reassembling our NV5600. This will be the second part of our rebuild series on this. The parts will not be listed inside of the video in this setting. They will be at the end to have a full list of all the parts we use that are available through us. The Miller parts listed are no longer available for purchase new.
Alright, so one thing that we do here, we'll work the main case. It's pretty common in these NV5600s that the rear bearings don't get the best oiling, so overfilling the transmission with a quart overfull is pretty standard. We'll move the camera here and you'll see it in a second, but we take one of the oil flow passages that's cast into the case, open it up, and then we clear the flashing off of the other passages just to try to maximize that oil flow to these rear bearings.
Be cool to do like a layout picture, like
Alright, so now we're going to take the two bearing races out of the back of the main case here. We're going to use for the main shaft bearing race, it's Miller part number 8237, sorry. And that will knock this race, it'll sit right there. And then for the countershaft bearing race, we found that TorqueKing 4x4's driver here, QT1802, seems to fit just perfectly in there. Okay, so we're going to pound the races back into the main case. For the main shaft and the counter shaft. For the main shaft, again, we're using the Miller 8237. And then for the counter shaft race, we're going to be using QT1801 from TorqueKing 4x4 here. We'll start with the main shaft race. Alright, and there we have it. The races are in. Main case is ready.
okay, so we're starting with reassembly now. We have our replacement used counter shaft. So we're going to start working on the front half first. So this is the washer we like to use. It's a third gear thrust washer. It's bronze and has the oil grooves. The one you may, if you have an early model, it'll come with a steel, just flat thrust washer. I suggest replacing them with a grooved version. There's also a plastic one. I suggest swapping to the bronze. So the brass, excuse me. So the brass thrust washer. Then we got one of our needle bearings from our needle bearing kit. We'll go on here. Okay. Then we got a nice clean replacement third gear from TorqueKing 4x4. Make sure it spins nice and free. I like to use just a little bit of engine assembly oil. You'll be able to feel if it's bound up or anything like that, but this is spinning really nice here. Okay, so now a trick that I like to use for putting on the hub, we got a little oven right here, and it's heating up our we have an oven right here. It's heating up our hub. So the next portion that's going to be going on here is this pressed on hub. We like to heat it up to about 300 degrees-ish for a couple minutes, get it nice and warm, and it should slide right on. Okay, so after we got third gear, needle bearing on, we're gonna go ahead and install one of our new synchros. We like to pre-lube it with a little bit of oil. That way, not anything dry scraping on the blocker rings. Okay, so give it a nice good liberal coating there. We're going to set the synchronizer directly on the gear. Your nice clean blocker ring will go right on there. Okay, so now you have your third gear synchronizer assembly put together. So one thing to just check, kind of push on it, make sure it locks with your gear. And as long as it does that, you're golden. So we have our hub here. It's been heating up for a little bit. Didn't work. Not quite long enough. Okay, we can press it. Womp womp, epic fail. Do we have? Okay, so you want to align your blocker ring to your hub. Oh, snaps right. So as you can see, the blocker ring will get locked in those little grooves. And there we have it. Looks good. So this is the very frustrating part. So what I'm going to do, there's a lot of ways. You might get creative and figure out your own way. This is just the way that I do it. So to assemble these keys and springs and balls, if you're reusing your stock ones, I don't recommend. But if you're reusing your stock springs, you can actually set the slider over there and kind of fish everything in down. With these new aftermarket springs, I found that's really hard, if not impossible. So what I try to do here is get the key and the spring set in, paying attention to your orientation. Kind of get it started like this. Now it's going to rest on the springs because they'll be protruding slightly. You're going to take these balls and you're going to grit your teeth and you're going to place them over the spring and push. And then you're going to hold that one at a time. So I found that you just might gotta check on your other springs from time to time. Okay, so now I'll get two of them in and I'll kind of push one down and it'll get started. Then I'll push the second one down if I can do this. There you go. So now that is retaining those little balls. And you gotta be very carefully pick this back up to put the third one in. And don't be, I might launch these. Don't be frustrated if it happens a couple times, especially when you're first starting out. Just like that. So I'll tell you that it took a long time to get that fast with it. Believe it or not, that was pretty fast. You may struggle with it for a while. Don't get too frustrated. Just take your time. Make sure you get everything seated. Nice simple movements. So from the top half here, we're going to set our blocker ring in. We're going to get another nice fresh synchronizer. Lube slightly. The oil that we prefer is Pennzoil Synchromesh or Redline MTL. You can use some other maybe cheaper stuff. May or may not be in a blue container for initial break-in. Okay, race retainer. To this race because there's a little bit of obvious movement there. So we've also been heating our race up here. Falls right on there. So we've been heating it up to about 300 degrees-ish for 15 minutes or so. Using a little bit of heat will help it slide right on there. You don't got to beat on it. So from there, we're gonna kind of let this cool for just a second. These needle bearing kits, we just use a little bit of engine assembly lube. Just coat the bearing pretty well. Set it down over the race. Do some spinning. So now you're gonna set your gear down on your synchros. It'll fall right in place there. Now we gotta move over to the press. These, you might remember these heavy splined gears. We're gonna start with number 6. Number 6 is the bigger of the two, and it's gonna face with the cone pointing towards the middle. So we're gonna set it right over. We're gonna use our Miller 8228. Okay, so we've got that one installed. So now, 5th gear is going to go on. So, one thing to take note when you're installing 5th gear, sometimes when you could be putting a ton of pressure on this thing and it'll get really close and it'll look like it's set in there, but if you can actually see light through there, it's not set all the way. It has to be completely closed up with 6th gear. Alright, I'll move back over there. We got Miller 8236. I need to see. So once we got our bearing put into place, we're going to check our snap ring. And so these snap rings come in different sizes. You can get all the correct sizes at TorqueKing 4x4. You want to make sure that it seats all the way around completely and fully and that you can't move it. This one you can move slightly, so I'm actually going to measure this one out and see if we can fit a bigger one in there. Okay. It's nice firm. This is a nice firm seat. Seated all the way around. I like that one. Lube here so that this bearing will be a little bit wet. We're not dousing it, but we're just giving it a little bit something on startup. Although okay, so flip this guy over here. shaft here. And we are in business. There's no snap ring or anything for this top one. Okay, so we've got ourselves an assembled countershaft completely. Alright. Okay, so the other side of the main shaft we're going to be working on here. We're going to start with second gear. So we're going to get our new second gear needle bearing. It's got a little bit of engine assembly lube on it. We're going to get our very clean second gear gently in place. Spin it around, make sure it spins nice and smooth, and it does. So, because 1 and 2 have this unique situation, the inner synchronizer, which is unique to 1 and 2, is going to go in there first. Oops. Cap off here. Do a little bit of pre-lube to both the inside and the outside of our fresh synchronizer. Okay. You don't want to just start these out dry. We want to minimize the amount of wear. Okay, so that's nice and pre-lubed. And our nice blocker ring goes over the top. Now our 1-2 synchro is assembled. Now you want to, again, do the same little test. These lock up very nicely. Okay, so the alignment for this hub is kind of unique. So when you put your hub down, it's going to be a spline fit, a tight interference fit on these splines. So we do got it heating up, but you're going to need to make sure that the inner lugs of the inner synchronizer ring and the outer lugs of the outer blocker ring all are in the right place when you drop your hub down. Sometimes if you're lucky you can spin the gear around if you're not a little bit off. There we go, the right way. I don't like your guys' toaster. It's going on straight.
It's a little high there.
A little high on this side? Okay. Well, that did feel like it.
It's driving straight now.
So I'm pausing to make sure both the inner and the outer.
Dude, just a piece of pipe.
I got pipe that might be a little more square.
Let's see what happens. Yeah, there we go. It went. So we got our hub pressed into place. I'll just go ahead with get the bearing installed here, or the bearing race installed. There you go. So the next step, we're still good?
Yep.
Okay. So the next step after we get the slider on there on the very first attempt ever, set the blocker ring down. We're gonna pre-lube our next synchro. Okay. I'm gonna set our new synchro in place. Now the inner synchronizer. And then, big old first gear management. Whoops, excuse me. The needle bearing goes in. And then, first gear. You kind of spin, and it'll seat down on the synchronizer. Give it a couple spins. She's nice and smooth, and that's first gear. Now, we've got a big old first gear thrust washer. Okay, and you can kind of see there's going to be witness marks for which way it goes. Doesn't really matter. Dimensionally, it's the same. Somebody here. Okay. And then after the thrust washer, we got this big old bearing. There we go. That's how it's supposed to go. Okay. Now we got our gear. Our bearing all the way against our thrust washer. Having a nice tube here, again Miller 8228. It's a huge hub. A couple hits for good measure and we're good to go. So we're gonna hunt for, this is the snap ring that came out. We're gonna give this one the first shot. It might be a little loose. So we don't want any inplay, forward or up or down, forward or back. Okay, so now we have our little Chrysler Reman shoulder support for reverse. Go ahead and pop that down all over. Bingo. Okay. Our main shaft on the output side is assembled. This is as far as we're going to go back here. So do up to 6 gear. Okay, so we're going to start doing this half of the main shaft here. Slide on our 6 gear needle bearing, our fresh new TorqueKing 4x4 6 gear. Get in place, give it a few turns. Turns nice and smooth. Okay. Next step, our new synchro. I'm only going to pre-lube the outside because there's no inner one on these. Okay. Coat the brass. Set it in place here. New blocker ring over the top. Okay. And again, we're going to test. We got plenty of friction. It locks and engages, so we're good to go there. Okay, so we got to give our hub here just a few more minutes. It's in the oven before we pop that on. Okay, so we've got our synchros in place, and we have our gear nice and warm. Betty Crocker oven here. Set it down onto the spline shafts. Still not going to go. There you go. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, it'll work. Give it a whack. There we go. It is seated. Okay.
Spring. Can't tell about the ball, but I didn't hear anything fall out. There we go. That's how it's done. Just got to swear at it a couple times.
6 minutes.
Okay. All right. So we're going to set our blocker ring on top here to kind of protect that, to protect the slider and keep the balls from going flying. We're going to set this aside. We got to prepare our input shaft to set it on top here. We do have to pop this bearing on there before I forget. Turn the heat up. Yes, that sucks. Okay, so for the last step for assembling our main shaft, we're going to throw our snap ring on the bearing here. Okay, now our main shaft is assembled. We're going to set up our input shaft to go on here. We can put them together and drop them in the bell housing. Okay, so inside our bearing here, you can see there's like a little retaining ring, and it is completely full of like a carbon buildup from synchro material and dirt and contaminants. Got to make sure we clean all that out and punch this thing out of there. It's an oil diverter that.
Hold it back a little bit farther.
Oh, sorry.
Like this. There we go.
So as you can see on the input shaft, there's these little oil holes. When you see the assembly on the bell housing, oil gets diverted and trapped by this diverter and channeled in through those holes to lubricate the pocket bearing on the end of the main shaft. So if it's all gummed up like this, you're going to have oil flow problems. So you need to make sure you change your fluid. It's not, it's not something you can ignore and have a healthy transmission. Do this so I look cool, okay? This will be better. There you have just this little bit here. So take this, scrub it out. You see, that's all just buildup that's blocking oil to the pocket bearing. All this crap. Okay, next. So now we have to pull this inner race here out of the input shaft. So the tool we're going to be using for this is the Miller L-4518. It's a whole assembly that comes with this all together. It's the internal race bearing, or bearing race puller. So you install the small part initially. Okay. As you tighten, it'll expand the jaws to grab the race. Nice and snug. Okay. And install the second part of the same L4518 assembly, and it fits over the top. Comes with a washer, the thrust bearing. Okay. And then normally you could do this without holding a small piece. Hey Wyatt, can you give me a hand here holding this thing? Exactly like that. See, and it pulls the bearing out, and now we have just a nice input shaft here. We're going to have to do some cleaning here, and we can reassemble with the new races. Alright, so first step to reassembling the input shaft, we're going to set a race for the pocket bearing, which goes inside right here. So this tool I'm using is Miller C-4628. This is the input, the race installer. This is important to actually have because the raised section, this rib, this will actually set the correct depth on your input shaft so that it's spaced correctly on the synchronizer. So that is something you need. This in case you don't, this ridge is just about dead nuts at 1/4 inch, 250 thou. That'll be the depth the race sits inside of the input shaft. So we're going to get this pressed in. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get this pressed in there. And set to the proper depth. Okay, so the next step to assembling our input shaft here, we're going to be pressing on our nice new bearing right here onto this race. And to do that, we're going to be using Miller MD998805. Plus some other spacers. And there we have it. Okay, so the last piece of this puzzle here, we're going to be putting our oil diverter. The little curved lip is going to be up. We're going to set it right in place. We're going to use TorqueKing special tool. Set it right there. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to get this in there. Pretty seated to me. So you can kind of see through the inside and make sure that it's seated all the way down. And you have an assembled input shaft. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to add just a little bit of assembly lube on this pocket bearing here. So that way it's got a little bit of lubrication on startup. Keep the bearing safe. And then we're going to use a little bit of our manual transmission lube to pre-lube this new synchronizer. half. And what we're going to do, set this down into the blocker ring. When we were assembling the shaft, we did put the blocker ring in here. And then you can simply set your input shaft down on top, turn it till it clicks in, choose assembly. Okay, so we have our bell housing here. We've already done some disassembly, so I'm just going to kind of walk you through how it goes. To remove the bell housing, obviously you saw us take all these extra bolts out along the edge here. To remove this input retainer, it's going to be another series of bolts, just remove them. You might have to smack this with a hammer to get like a little mallet to get it off, but once it comes off, it's going to look like this. So we'll start in here. Your races, this upper race here, you can just knock it out. It's pretty easy. It'll likely have a shim behind it to set your end play. On the main shaft, obviously the shim goes on the back side of this. You can simply set it to the side for later. For the countershaft down here, you're going to notice there's a little oil diverter. You simply push it out. It's not necessarily a super tight press fit. You set this aside. You need it. This diverts the oil into the countershaft. These you'll likely have to press out. So this is a spacer, like a spacing collar. These shims to set end play go between the spacing collar and the race on the other side. So you can see, the camera might pick it up. There are some shims on the inside. Obviously this is loose, so we'll need to fix that. But we'll need to find a tool here and press these out. There you'll find the right size. Okay. There you go. Okay, so to actually knock out this race here, I'm going to find a nicely fitted race driver. Comes right out. And you'll notice the race and the shims are between it. Now we're going to flip this over. And now we can take this guy out of here. Maybe so good? So now to drive this spacer out, slightly larger, comes right out. Oops. You can see it's just simply a spacer. Usually there's some retaining stuff on there. And so that sits right in here when it's assembled to divert the oil into the countershaft. So now to press out this race, we're going to be using Miller 8245 and just a standard driver. Okay, so we're going to pull out one of these shift rail bushings. They're available most places. TorqueKing 4x4 has them. You can stick your finger in here and kind of feel the condition of them. You know, if they're really smooth, that's great. If they're scored at all, you need to replace them. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit this with a little bit of heat. When you're removing anything from this bell housing, you really want to use a lot of heat, especially doing the pivot ball. The pivot ball, you have to use a lot of heat or you'll break it when it comes off, and that becomes very problematic. So make sure you use a lot of heat before you try to back that off. So then we're going to be using Miller 8233 assembly, which is the tool that you use to remove these. Okay. And use the washer. You hear that little pop. It means it starts moving. Heat really helps that happen a lot easier. Just make sure you use a little bit. Boom. There we have it. Now we have a nice smooth bore to replace our shift rail bushing. As you can see, this bell housing was in pretty good shape. So as you can see, this bushing was in pretty good shape. If they're this clean and smooth, you don't really need to replace them. It's always good to. Sometimes they'll be pretty scored up depending on what kind of condition the transmission's in. If you're going to replace these, you need to get 12 because there's 6 here and 6 in the case. So make sure you get enough for both to replace them. We're going to remove this for a second here. The second part of disassembly here. So this is your input bearing retainer. This one's obviously pretty rough. So you're going to notice there's a oil diverter. It's simply pressed in. You can pry them out pretty easily just with a hand tool. You can see they come out, they're pretty gross. This diverts oil into the input shaft, and then just inside there, you'll see you have your input seal. So this guy's a little bit of a pain to get out, but you can simply use a seal puller. Try to get behind it and yank it out. So the seals come in any bearing rebuild. 5600 rebuild kit with bearings. When they say seals, they'll come with this. They won't come with these. TorqueKing 4x4 has these for replacement. They're pretty cheap. It's always a good idea just to replace them. And they'll come out nice and brand new like this. And you can press them right back in exactly the same way they came out.
Okay, so now we have the bell housing here. We're prepping the races to go in. Also wanted to show you the shift rail bushings. Miller tool 8238 works good for getting these bushings put back in. This is already ready to go. We're going to use on the Countershaft race, we're using TorqueKing number QT1802 to get this race put in here. We will drive it in so it is flush with the bell housing and the hammer. Yep. That's good. Input race. We're going to use Miller tool 8245 and drive in 1/4 inch out the back. Let's just get it. Okay, that's it. That should do it.
Yes.
Now that we have the races in the bell housing, we're going to install the shims for the countershaft. This goes between the race and the spacer. So these are going to drop in place. You don't have to start with the shims. This one had 3. We're going to stick 2 going back in just to help us get closer to our final end play spec. Shim drops, or the spacer drops in, and then the oil diverter goes facing this way down in there. It is a snug fit, just like that. All right, next step is to install your bearing retainer right here, and we're going to install all these bolts. We're not going to torque them at this point, we're just going to install. These will get Loctited, but that'll happen after our end play is fully set. Gotcha.
Okay, so we're going to start some disassembly on the tail housing here. During our initial disassembly, we took out that large plug that had a spring and a detent. Well, this detent enters through this little port right here, and it will engage on these little notches. This little flag guy right here. One of the shift rails fits in here with a keyway, and that gives you the nice engagement feeling going left to right with your shifter. So we need to make sure that we take this out and clean it. So we're going to use a 10mm, remove this one bolt. Sometimes it can be a little tight. Okay. You can simply remove this one bolt right here and the little flag. We're going to clean out here really well. The other thing we're going to do here is pull this race out. This race is for the reverse idler, so we're going to use the same tool again, the Miller L4518. Sometimes if you pull this off of a running truck, it's very often that you can remove these races by hand or maybe with a small pry bar. They're not terribly tight, usually. This one is, so we're going to try this way. Thank you, sir. There we have it. So you'll notice a shim came out from behind that. This shim is used to set the end play on the reverse idler, or the reverse countershaft. Countershaft gear. We'll be setting that end play after separately, and we may or may not end up using a shim. But as you can, it always goes back here, just like that, to space it up out of the tail housing. And that's that. So now the gear set's in place, we're going to take it back up slightly so that we can insert the shift rails. Now that we've kind of got it into a position, we can work around it on the bench. So he's going to take it up probably about 1.5 inches or so. So now we're going to start grabbing shift rails. So the parts that are really going to hang you up, you got to make sure every gear is in neutral. You can tell that by having the slider in the center of the hub. And then this little collar right here is going to move freely on the shift rail. And when they start getting out of alignment, you're going to have a tough time. All the little pulls on the forks and stuff like that are going to get kind of caught in all sorts of different gears. So you got to really take your time. I find it helps to kind of have it bent, the link of the bent inward. It might get frustrating. You might have to go up and down a few times, working on your, just kind of getting everything sorted out. You might see I would kind of go around and shake some shift rails and kind of help them find their natural point. It'll eventually get in there as long as you have the orientation right. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to add our 5/6 crossover cam. So this has to fit both into your 5/6 shift rail, or your 5/6 shift, and the shift rail there, and it also has to fit into the same one here. And then you're going to install this pivot point. It helps to kind of, at this point, shift the transmission to 6th gear. And then you can rock this down. You may have to slightly raise, kind of sit here and wiggle on this shift rail. This will eventually get lined up. Once it's lined up and you have that little pin in the groove, if it sounds confusing what I'm talking about when you're actually doing it, it'll make a little bit more sense. Is that little hammer?
Little guy.
Okay. So once the crossover cam is inside of the rail, and it's inside of the rail over here, your bracket has to go into that pin and have that slide over the groove, and then drop it down over the dowels. Make sure that position. And tap it down. Point. Shift it out of 6th gear here. And keep tapping. And get it into place. Then pick up your hardware that went flying. We're going to add some Loctite. We're going to install them right here. Now those are tight. The factory torque spec for these 2 bolts is 28 foot-pounds. Feels like it's going way too fast. Do you like this?
This looks a little better.
Oh, wow.
Easy. Don't let that cable come off.
Oh yeah, that'd be a bad day. No. Yeah, that'd be a bad day.
Towards me. Towards me. Okay. Alright. Go ahead real slowly. You're probably gonna, because we're at such a steep angle.
Back up.
Yeah. Nice and slow. Maybe pause right there. I'm actually gonna hop up here. If that's okay.
No dancing on the bar.
This is Coyote Ugly, right?
Going?
Go ahead. So we're gonna, slow down. So you're gonna slowly align on your shift rails. Looks like you're in, you're good. Nice and slow. Reverses. There we go. Okay. Yeah, go ahead and keep lowering your tone. Nice and slow.
We're hung up on something, I can see it. There you go.
It's gonna get kind of not necessarily pink, but there's a lot of notches on that reverse shifter. So let me know we're about an inch from setting her down.
Getting close to that, yeah.
Up there.
Yeah.
All of our shift rails are lined up. Okay. Drop her. Slowly but quickly. There we go. We are in business. Okay, so what we're gonna do now, we're gonna take a handful of these. We're going to install these in order to move it. And we're going to have to tilt it slightly to put, a couple on the inside up here, just to be able to swing it to the ground.
15.
Where's yours?
That's right there.
Yeah. All right.
Let's set her down.
Because we got a turbo heat one? Yeah.
Okay, so we got the case dropped onto the bell housing. We've got some of these bolts in here just kind of snugged up, and we got two on the inside, so we're able to swing it off the table. What we're going to do is we're going to set it down. We got a nice little blanket here to save the paint, but we're just going to tilt it back, set it down, so that we can complete the bell housing bolt torque and bell housing bolt torque sequence. Yeah, go ahead and the Loctite's right there. Go ahead and start ramming them in there. So it helps to straddle it and hold it between your legs. A lot. So there's no specified torque sequence in the factory service manual for this transmission. You can do star pattern if like. Factory torque spec is 48 foot-pounds. push like under 6th gear? Yep. It's fine. So push up, push down. Holy Jesus. Okay, so that is far too much. Is it? Oh. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, it's okay.
So we're gonna
Actually, that lifting mechanism, if you had it on that and set it on the table, it'd keep it from this one.
your helper. That's good. It's about 3. Go ahead. Actually, I like it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
It was not mentioned, but here Wyatt is measuring both sides of where the reverse idler shaft will go to make sure he puts in the proper amount of trim.
Just like that, yeah. It's just easier to keep it vertical.
So shims before the race to set the end plate on the reverse idler.
It's reverse countershaft.
Reverse countershaft. What size that is.
So now, put this on there for a little bit of good measure. And then we're going to put our reverse shift fork in. And we're gonna, okay, so then we're going to slide our reverse hub assembly over. You got to make sure, can you grab a small mallet, Wyatt? Give it a little tappy. King Explorer. It's probably the first time that's ever happened.
Yeah, try to keep it clean in here.
We need the now this one is not a very tight fit, so normally just a little bit of heat will get her to drop right on. Yeah, that shaft really will sap the heat out of it very quickly.
We did not get it on film, but there was a bearing race that was installed onto the shaft.
King reverse gear. She spins nice. Okay. So now we're gonna put our fancy thrust washer. I'm gonna put just a slight bit on here. Our fancy thrust washer with the raised portion facing up. Now we're going to pound our roll pin in here, get our larger bearing and our main shaft nut prepared. Good, okay. So then this nice roller bearing should just push right on, just like that. And we're going to get our new Torque King main shaft nut. So that's going to hang out there for the meantime while we punch our roll pin.
No pressure. Here we go.
So we're going to assemble our reverse idler setup. I like to throw a little bit of engine assembly lube on these bearings as well. Okay, so it goes small needle spacer, small needle. And then whenever Assistant Jesse here did a fantastic job cleaning this, we're going to throw our gear on there. Cap it with another new idler washer. And then our reverse countershaft gear. Now when you put oil on that, it kind of gets a little bit hydro locked, so just smack it a few times. Now we're going to tighten the main shaft nut. We're going to get a little bit of Loctite on it before we finish cinching it down. And you want to apply a little bit of red. Okay, so we got it tightened up there. So we're going to use our fancy schmancy holding tool, and then our Torque King main shaft nut socket. We're gonna hit 250 foot-pounds someday. There we go.
Memory card is full.
Okay, so now that we have our main shaft nut torqued to 250 pounds, there's a gap here in the main shaft specifically for staking. Okay. All right, well, that concludes that. Still spins very nice. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so next step is the case detent. Okay. I'm gonna do kind of make sure it's go. So neutral. So this detent controls like that nice ratchety, not really ratchety, but it's the detent that controls that good positive shift feel forward and reverse on this shift rail. The little bias rollers right here, they fit inside that flag, and that controls that good positive shift feel side to side. So it's important to have those springs in good shape to have a good feeling shift lever. So we're going to install our nice rear bias pin here, and I use a little bit of engine assembly lube because it's kind of sticky. You want something to help retain this because you do have to slip the little tunnel for it over when you install the rear housing. So make sure that they're kind of glued in place a little bit. All right. So before we get too far, we got to make sure that we install our little shift blocker. It goes right in here. Make sure you check your shifter in there to make sure you're in the right kind of spot. We need to move this up slightly. Can you grab that pry bar? You lift up right there just slightly. Ever so. See, there we go. Now we're turning. Okay. Use a little bit of Loctite, and the torque spec is 41 foot-pounds. Okay.
There you go. Right onto that one. Gotta get in there.
Okay, so we're going to install our rear seal that comes in the kit. Use a little race driver. It's in. All right. Okay, so we're going to lower the extension housing on. We've got a nice spread out surface of, gasket surface is covered with anaerobic sealant. Everything's been kind of pre-lubed. So one thing to take note of is your orientation of your rear bias. You want to make sure that it's angled in the same way that your little flag receiver here is for the rear bias. So when you set this down, that has to slide in there, and if it's kinked at all, those things can come off. Go down your transmission, you're gonna have to fish for them with a magnet. So just try to avoid that. I found it helps to lower it down with a cherry picker very, very slow, while keeping an eye on it to make sure it goes in there. Back it up.
Goddamn thing.
The torque spec for the rear extension housing bolts is 35 foot-pounds. It was not mentioned in the video, but installing the side covers, they must be sealed with silicone or some other type of sealant. We also offer coolers that go in place of those, even compatible with 5-inch exhaust on this type of Cummins truck.